Tim Goldstein, autistic adult, and your host for Life in a Neurotypical Universe, where we take a look at life from the perspective of an autistic adult. We have something a little bit different today for Life in a Neurotypical Universe. This particular piece is something that I recorded as a presentation that I gave for Uptimize. Uptimize is the leader in corporate training for neurodiversity, and occasionally I do presentations and trainings for them as I am part of their advisory board. In this particular one, I was presenting to a major healthcare company here in the U.S. doing what they refer to as a lunch and learn. The lunch and learn is basically a Neurodiversity 101, just an introduction to the whole subject to help people understand better what neurodiversity actually is. It was kind of fun and kind of different because I was presenting off of their slides, but I was able to give it my own personal spin and details to fill it in. I think you're going to enjoy it. It was a fun presentation and it was quite well received. Would love to hear your feedback. Let's dive on in. These are the topics that we're going to be covering for today. We're going to be covering what are relevant terms so that you can understand what some of the terminology is that we use when we're talking about neuro-inclusion, neurodiversity. Then we'll be taking a little bit of a look at why does neuro-inclusion matter? Then we'll be moving into how to approach neurodiversity, some ideas and tips about dealing with other individuals that may be neurodiverse. And then we're also going to be beginning a neuro-inclusive culture. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we are going to go into a Q&A session at the end so that you can ask questions, and everything's going to be fair game. And I'd be more than happy to answer as many of them as we can get through. First thing is relevant terms so that we all understand what it is that we're talking about. And the first term that comes up is the term neurodiversity. So what is neurodiversity? I'm going to give you the way I like to explain it, which is a little more of a story than maybe some use. But the way I like to think about it is we accept the fact that different people have different color eyes. I happen to have blue eyes. People have brown eyes. People have green eyes. People have hazel color eyes. There's even people with gold color eyes. And we don't think anything about, oh, those blue-eyed people, they're just this way, and we can't deal with blue-eyed people. We just accept it's just part of being human. The humans have different color eyes, and that is just perfectly okay. But what we don't think about is the brain. And the human brain is the most complex organ that we have. Some people will say it's the most complex thing in the universe even. Now, if our eyes can vary by color and shape and such, our brains, being that much more complex, should vary even more. And the reality is they do. And it can be a bunch of different things. Modern medical imaging allows us to take a look at the brain in ways that we never understood. And we find that different people's brains have more of the white matter that connects different parts of the brains together. Some of them are wired different ways. Some of them have more wiring. Some have less wiring. Where they're folded, how many folds, all those things can vary. And that is just normal for humans. Just like we accept eye color being normal, we expect that brains that vary are normal. But what that causes is, as the brains vary, it's going to cause the person to perceive, process, and think in a manner that is going to be different from a person that has a different brain. So we again look at the fact that people perceive, process, and think in different ways as just being part of the natural variation of humans. If we want to just put it in a little nutshell, that is what neurodiversity is all about. That there's really not a standard typical brain. All of us have different brains. We're all individuals. Sometimes we may be a little closer to each other and that puts us into a particular group. But the reality is, even in the group, we're still individuals because we all have different brains. We all perceive, we all process differently. So at the top line, that is what neurodiversity is. Let's step into neurodiversity a little more. Again, just standard variation of brains gives people different ways to perceive, process, and think. And again, I'm horrible with these slides that have things that keep popping in. So, bear with me. I already talked about that. Now we actually go and divide, and there's another term that's not on here that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to explain this in a method of what I refer to as the neurocloud. And in the neurocloud, I like to think about, if you've been to a state fair or county fair or one of those kind of things, they have that box where it's got money just floating all over in the air, and you're supposed to guess how much money it is, or I think that's how the game's played. Think of it, though, instead of if we were to take all humans and represent every way that a human can perceive, process, and think as being a different piece of confetti and glitter. And we have them just all swirling around inside this cloud, because when you have clouds, things swirl around inside clouds. And nobody can get out of the neurocloud. If you are alive and you have a brain that does function, in other words, you're not in a coma or something, you are part of neurodiversity. Being the majority group doesn't get you out of neurodiversity, just like me being a white male doesn't get me out of diversity. I'm still part of diversity. Everybody is part of neurodiversity. So think about all this confetti and glitter floating around. Things start clumping together. So some more similar things clump together. We end up with one group that is much larger than the others. And that group we refer to as being neurotypical. And I used to say it was the largest group, but I then went and for another presentation put together and started adding up what the prevalence is according to the National Institute of Health of a number of the different conditions that we consider to be part of what we call the neurodistinct or neurominority, some people like to use. I like neurodistinct because I like being distinct, not a minority, because I think it sounds better. But they mean the same thing. And when I added those up, what I came out to was if I just took the top 5 and I left out about 15 different conditions, I was over 52% of the population already. And what dawned on me is neurotypical aren't the largest group, they're the largest cohesive group. But because they're the largest cohesive group, they're the ones that get to set what the general norms are in most of society. Now, if you're hanging out with a group of ADHD people or you're hanging out with a group of autistic people, obviously, who's the largest group? You just picked a specific segment. Things will be different within that group. But when we're talking in just the general, out in the general populace, in the workplace, neurotypicals are going to be the majority of humans. And it's not that they're special. It's not that they're unique. It's not that being neurotypical is better than not being neurotypical. It just is. It's just there's a similarity in the way that they think. They tend to be able to communicate and work together a little more easily. But of course, as we said, everybody's an individual. There is no homogeneous group there. There's individuals. There's going to be still challenges between people. It's kind of human nature. Now, when we get into, and again, I'm just going to use the term neurodistinct because I like that term better. When we get into the neurodistinct, that would be people that perceive, process, or think in a distinctly different manner than neurotypicals. So that is the definition, is simply thinking, perceiving, processing distinctly different. And in that particular group, I don't know, I'm probably supposed to push the button on another slide. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. So there we go. So this tells us some of the groups that fall into being neurodistinct. And it includes autism. And actually, the whole idea of neurodiversity came out of autism originally. It came from a woman named Judy Singer from Australia. And she is autistic. And she was writing about her family and herself in a thesis paper. And her family has autism running through it. And she came up with this idea that became what we refer to as neurodiversity. But as it moved forward, we started recognizing it wasn't only autism. So that's the first thing to really remember is when we talk about neurodiversity or the neurodistinct, we're not talking about only autism. And a lot of people think it is. And that's just because that's where it developed from. But we now recognize that there's many, many other groups of people who do have a different way that they perceive the world, that they process, that they think about things. And there's a list here. You can see dyslexic people, dyspraxic, ADHD. You can go on OCD. I mean, it goes on and on. There's quite an extensive list of people who interact with the world and see the world as a completely different perspective. And that is the neurodistinct. Now, the big thing to take away from this is just think about in this cloud, you got one big group, it's neurotypicals. Again, individuals, but enough similarity, we can group them. Outside, neurodistinct, a lot of different neurodistinct categories within that, including ones that don't have medical names. It's just people that perceive, process, and think in uniquely different ways, but there's no medical condition associated to it. And what you can really take away from that is the further apart you are. So let's just say we're in the neurotypical range, we move further apart in the neurotypical range, the more difficult the communication is going to be. So maybe you have two neurotypicals, but one grew up here in America and one grew up in, India. We have more challenges communicating because we don't have that common shared level of, socialization as we grew up. Makes the communication harder, even though both are neurotypical. And if you have to communicate over to the neurodistinct, just think of it as adding more distance between you because the communication becomes harder because the way that they perceive, process, and think about the world is going to be far more different than if you were talking to another neurotypical. So that's really the big takeaway from the cloud model and explaining neurotypical, neurodistinct. So in the workplace, what we really wanted to try and create is this idea of neuro-inclusion. And neuro-inclusion is really actively involving people who perceive, process, and think in all different ways. So they use different communication styles, they look at different things, they understand things in different ways. I like to tell a little story to give an idea of how differently people can look at things. And this is a story out of my own personal life. And just by the way, I'm autistic and I was diagnosed at 54. So I went through lots of life not knowing I was autistic. I just thought the world was stupid. It wasn't an effective way to think about the world, but it was the best I could come up with because I didn't know I was different. So fast forward, now I understand I'm autistic. Autistics have a tendency to eat the same things over and over again. Lunch and breakfast tend to be the ones I do. My wife likes variety, so dinners, we have variety for dinners. I was on a kick of eating roast beef sandwiches on potato bread. And I won't say it's a health kick by any means. Certainly you're in the medical realm, that's not a probably healthy diet, but they really did taste good. And it had to be a particular brand of potato bread. And my wife and I would go to the store. We'd walk into the aisle where the bread was. They'd never put the stuff in the same place. I'd be reading the labels, looking for the brand name of my favorite bread. And she would just go and point and go, it's right over there, honey. And I'd walk over and sure enough, she just instantly found it and pointed right to it. After about a year and a half, I finally asked her, how is it you do that? And what she said to me was very illuminating. She said, it's really simple. I just look on the end of the wrapper and your bread has an orange circle on the end of the wrapper. Well, I can see color. When she pointed out the orange circle, I could see the orange circle. The problem was, to me, the information all lied in the text. That's where information for me sits. It sits in the words. For her, she's actually ADHD, and her processing is more pattern recognition style processing, and she's very, very sensitive to colors. So she just found a way to identify the bread without worrying what the details of the name are. I'm looking for the details of the name. You can see two very, very different processing styles. And in this case, she had one that was much better and much faster. But I do like to say I finally did win a couple months ago. We were in looking for her favorite coffee, and we're in the aisle, and she comes up to me finally and says, honey, I don't think they have my coffee. We'll have to go somewhere else. And I reach up and grab the box and hand it to her. And guess what? They had rebranded. The box that used to be a solid color now had a picture on it, but the words were still the same. So you can see, now my looking at the words for the information was valuable because the look of the box changed. On the other hand, on the bread where it hadn't changed, her method was definitely much, much faster and quicker. So that can give you an idea of how different people can actually perceive, process, and think, which when somebody mentions an idea, they're in a conference room, you're discussing something, and they come up with an idea that just makes no sense to you. Well, that's probably because they look at the world in a completely different way than you look at the world. Not that it's better, not that it's worse, just like not that my wife's method is better or my wife's method is worse. They're just two different methods that sometimes one is better, sometimes the other's better. Sometimes they're about equal, doesn't matter. Either one would do the job just perfectly fine. So why neuroinclusion matters, before I step into that too much, I'm actually going to just say a little bit about neuroinclusion and just general diversity. To me, neurodiversity is not separate or different from diversity. Diversity tends to look at things from the outside, things we can see. And then we have to start understanding how people are different when we identify them by those particular groupings. And obviously, again, everybody's always an individual. All autistics aren't like me by any stretch of the imagination. Just like I don't think any of you would say you're the exemplar for whatever group you identify with. But I actually think if you take neurodiversity and think about diversity through the lens of neurodiversity, what's the difference between somebody who grew up in one country and culture versus somebody who grew up in another country or culture, or somebody who grew up in a different segment of America and had a different experience because of their color or their orientation or whatever of the diversity groups? And really what's different is they think differently because they had a different experience. So whether it's we think differently because our brains are different, or we think differently because we were cultured and had a different experience, diversity really comes down to understanding people that think differently than you do. So I actually think neurodiversity is really kind of overarching. All diversity fits into neurodiversity. We could think about it from that standpoint of what's the difference between having two X chromosomes and having an X and Y chromosome? Well, the two groups kind of have different ways of perceiving the world. That's the difference. So I like to put it that way. Now, moving on to neuroinclusion and why neuroinclusion matters, because it does matter, just like all of diversity matters. The business case for neuroinclusion. What is it? Why is it that we want to be inclusive? And I think we understand in the diversity world and in neurodiversity, it really is similar, but there are some extra strengths that you can get out of the neurodistinct categories. So let's take a look at them. The first thing is, it can give an advantage to businesses by giving you access to talent that you're having a hard time finding. Unfortunately, people who are neurodistinct, and it varies by the particular neurodistinction as to what the numbers are. With autism, it's considered that a very large percentage of autistic individuals, even autistic individuals with college degrees, are under or unemployed. And if you go into ADHD, they have the same problem. Dyslexic have the same problem. But each group, the percentage may vary, but you still have a higher percentage of unemployment and underemployment than you have in the general population, which means if you can learn how to integrate those people into your company, you now have a candidate pool that other people aren't trying to draw from because they're not willing to integrate them into their company. So definitely an advantage. Recruiting's been tight over the last few years. If you can have an area to recruit from that has higher unemployment, you're probably going to be able to find more and better people than if you're trying to pick between the last 2% that, I guess, what do we have? 3% unemployment, they say. In 3% unemployment, there's not a lot of people to pick from. But if you go to autism, where it's thought to be 25, 30% unemployment, you got a lot of people to pick from. So that's one big advantage, is access to talent. Then another thing is comfort at work. by being neuro-inclusive, the first thing is lots of companies think that they don't have any neurodistinct individuals working there. Now, why? Well, first off, they just haven't learned how to understand what a neurodistinct person may act like, be like, so they don't know. Secondly, neurodistinct individuals, for the most part, don't go about making a big deal of saying what they are unless there's a reason to do it. And in most companies, saying that, hey, I'm autistic is not going to get you anywhere except scrutiny. So we increase the comfort at work because you do already have individuals that are very different from each other already working for you. And by having them see that you recognize that people have different ways to communicate, different ways that they do the same jobs, different ways that they like to process their work, we make everybody more comfortable. So that's another big thing. And again, that's going to be, we'll talk about universal design, but that's where a universal design thing. Not only does it help the neurodistinct, it helps everybody be more comfortable at work when people are willing to recognize that you have a different style than they have. And it's not good, it's not bad, it's just different. And sometimes that can be a huge advantage that it's different. Retention. Again, retention, comfort at work, they kind of go hand in hand with each other. We all want to retain people. And I think most of us like to stay at the same company. I don't think all of us like jumping from job to job to job. That's not really a fun thing to do, of always starting out as being the new person on the block. And we'd much rather stay at a place where we feel comfortable, where we feel valued. And by practicing neuroinclusion, people will feel valued for their uniqueness, just like practicing diversity. And like I say, neurodiversity, diversity, it's really just expanding diversity. And if you feel valued, you're probably going to stay around because people value you. And I think we all like to be valued. And then productivity. Different people have different skills and abilities. Started with the whole neurodiversity movement, started in the tech world. And some of the initial companies that really started doing it were Microsoft, SAP, DXC. So a variety of big, major global tech companies. So they were obviously focusing on tech. So we have a lot of statistics that are based around the tech world. But what they found was that very often, when they brought in autistic individuals, because they originally focused only on autistic individuals, that if they matched them up with the appropriate job role for the way that they processed, perceived, and interacted with the world, they got people that were far more productive than what the average team was that did the same thing. I don't remember the exact numbers, so this is kind of off the top of my head, making up the numbers, but there was a QA group, and I don't remember which one of the big companies it was at. They obviously had QA groups for a long time that were just normal mix of employees, but they had a QA group that was all autistics. And the QA group that was all autistics was something along the lines of 2.3 times as effective in getting work done as the standard QA group. And it just was because some of the traits that they had made them far more effective at doing that specific job. Now, that's true of all of us, of course. If we're given a job that happens to match our skills, our abilities, our traits, we're going to do a better job and perform better. But again, more variation. When we go to the neurodistinct, there's more variation in there. If we can match them up, you're going to probably get more and better performance. I do like to always throw in, though, it doesn't always mean that just because somebody's neurodistinct that they're going to have a superpower and be just amazing. Maybe you'll just end up with a really good, solid, loyal employee. Hey, that's not bad either. And then the last one we have here, which I'm going to look down at my screen, not looking away from you, but the big slides that I can read are down here. So that's why if I look down, I'm not ignoring you. Innovative thinking. Innovative thinking is a lot. If we go back to the story I gave about the bread with my wife and I, and then the coffee, scene, you can see two completely different ways of thinking. And if we can bring that innovative thinking, because each one of those groups, dyslexics tend to have strengths in certain areas of the way they think. People who are ADHD have strengths in certain areas of the way they think. And again, we're all individuals, so this is generalizing. It's not saying every person with ADHD is going to have a certain way, but in general, these traits will be more common. And I like to say that they're human traits at uncommon levels, because we can find the same trait in any group of humans. So they're not ADHD traits, they're not autism traits. They're just human traits that are at a level that might be higher or lower than is common for the normal group. So innovative thinking is something that you can really get by having individuals who do think in different ways, because that's the saying that we always hear. We always hear, think outside of the box, which means don't think the way that you're always thinking about it. But it's hard to think a different way than you think. I mean, that's how your brain's wired. That's how your brain's going to work. So if you bring in people who have brains that are wired different ways, you're going to have different thoughts, different perspectives. And I like to say, what makes me feel as if I belong, and this is really how the trick to getting the innovative thinking out of different groups, even out of the groups you have right now, is I always feel like I belong when somebody will listen to the idea I have and consider it as if it could possibly be a good solution. I'm not saying they got to take it. I just want them to at least look at it and examine it and say, that's different than we thought, but let's take a look. There might be something there. And if they say that, I feel like I belong. They're valuing me. They're saying, hey, it's a different opinion, but let's take a look at that. Let's examine that. And I think that's a big trick to getting the innovative thinking that you already have, and especially out of the neurodistinct, is they have to feel valued. Why would you give an odd or different idea if it's just going to get shot down as, that's not how we do things around here? Well, you may as well just keep your mouth shut up as opposed to being put down. So consider when you have different ideas of, let's take a look. There might be something there. Maybe there isn't, but you don't know if you don't examine the idea. Come on, clicker, go click, click, click. Oh, my clicker's not playing fun for me. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. How to approach neuro-inclusion. So how do we go about increasing our neuro-inclusion? And the first thing is, and we mentioned this a few times, is the idea of universal design. And universal design is something, think of the curb cuts that are put in for wheelchairs. How many times has the curb cuts been handy for you because maybe it was a baby stroller that you're pushing, or maybe it was a shopping cart, or maybe you were on a scooter, or maybe you were on a bicycle, and that curb cut was just really, really handy. So even though it was done for people who use wheelchairs, it was a universal design method that enabled and helped many of us. Another idea of universal design is closed captions. How many times have you been somewhere? You've been at the restaurant with the family and friends, and instead of listening to them, you've been watching the sports show or your favorite whatever show on the TV in the corner, and you can't hear the sound, but they got the closed captions turned on, and you now know what's going on and what the score is. We all benefited from it, but closed captions were really created for people that had hearing deficiencies. But we've all, I'm sure, benefited at some point from having those words right there on the screen. So those are just some of the ideas about universal design. We already know that different people have different strengths, they have different communication styles, they see the world in different ways, and not everybody's going to disclose. So you can't just go around and say, well, let's find the people that are different and we'll just go do something for those particular groups of people. Because there's a lot of barriers to saying that you're different. And it takes, for a lot of people, it takes a lot to do that. You have to overcome often a lifetime of being told that, why can't you be like everybody else? In other words, your difference was always put down. So you just hide it. You don't tell anybody about it. So that's another reason why we want to use universal design is you likely have many employees that already are neurodistinct. And you don't know it, and they're not going to tell you. But if you do some of the different approaches that go with universal designs, you will then end up enabling everybody to be more effective. Just like that curb cut helps everybody. It helped one group a lot, but it helped everybody also. And then some of the people that have fall into the neurodistinct categories don't even know it themselves. As I said, I was diagnosed at 54. I didn't know that I was autistic. I managed to make it 5 decades without having a clue that I was autistic. So it's not that everybody's going to know. Now, as you go to the younger generations, we get into the Gen X and Gen Ys, the schools have gotten better at recognizing these things. More of the kids know that they are dealing with being different. So they're more prepared for the world because of that. But as we start getting into older ages, schools didn't know about it. We got through without them knowing, because when I went to school, and I graduated in 77, autism was considered nonverbal children only. And as you've probably figured out, Tim is plenty verbal. So there was no way I could have been autistic as far as they were concerned, because that was the definition at the time. So I went through life not knowing. Did it cause me problems? Yeah, probably. I had a lot of success, but I had lots of failures and getting fired too. So not everybody is going to know that they are. It's actually kind of funny. Some of the biggest groups that are getting diagnosed with ADHD, for instance, is women that are in their 40s and above are now being diagnosed with ADHD, because ADHD in females, even just autism also in females, tends to present differently than it does in males. So they had the definitions of what it should look like, but it's like heart attacks. We know now from the medical world that women for a long time were sent home from the emergency room because they didn't think they had the heart attack, and they were dropped dead, and they were having a heart attack. And why? Because they didn't have the symptoms that they were taught to look for a heart attack, because 80% of women have heart attack symptoms that are different than men's heart attack symptoms. 20% of men also have the more female type symptoms, and they didn't get diagnosed either. So all they really caught was the 20% of women that had more of a male presentation of heart attacks. So same thing is going on in neurodiversity. There is definitely differences between the genders in how it presents. So we're now trying to catch up. So there definitely is a lot of intersectionality going on, and with the wrong intersections, you just totally get missed, unfortunately. So another thing that we have to consider is, while universal design is certainly a great thing, and it's going to cover a huge amount of what we need to do, we have to recognize, again, everybody is an individual, and we want to put a person-centered approach inside of the universal design. So the universal design will take care of a lot of the bigger areas, but then we have to look at each individual and find out how best to help the individual. First off, we want to know, how do they identify? We deal with the LGBTQ+, and it's become very normal to use pronouns. And I think you can see on the screen, I have my pronouns up there, and I also have autistic in there. And I think that they had a great idea. You can't tell by looking at somebody what their orientation is. And to treat them respectfully, you need to understand their orientation. You can't tell by looking at me that I'm autistic, but to understand me, you need to know I'm autistic. So I just put autism in as being part of my pronouns. So we need to know how people identify. I'm very upfront about it. Not everybody is. But if we don't know how they identify, we don't know how to really interact with them appropriately. Comfort with the process. The whole process, if you have the universal design, you come up with a process to try and help individuals find the appropriate supports and such they need to be comfortable with it. They need to feel it's safe to go in and say, hey, I need an accommodation. If they think that asking for an accommodation is going to put them under scrutiny because, they're asking for something extra, they're not going to ask for the accommodation and not be comfortable with the process. And the funny part is, if you look at the Job Accommodation Network, they say that the average for years, it hasn't changed, $500 or less for an accommodation for most any condition. Or that not most, for any condition is what they covered. When you deal with conditions that deal with neurodiversity, they actually cost less because a lot of the accommodations are free. They're as easy as moving somebody from a desk that's right next to a door to one that's away from the door so they don't have to hear a door slamming all the time. That's free, but it can allow somebody that can't block that noise out to work effectively. So you got to make sure that there's comfort with the process. The process isn't seen as being, oh, you're asking for special stuff. It's simply seen as, we want you to perform the best you can, and what we need to do to help you do that, that's the perfect thing to do. Then the supports needed. What are those supports? So first off, they've got to be comfortable with the process. Secondly, we now need to be able to figure out what are appropriate supports to give them. And Uptimize does a phenomenal job on teaching on a range of supports. The great resource also, if none of you have ever used it, is jobaccommodationNetwork.org. It's actually, the website is askjan.org. And it goes by different conditions in both physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and it gives recommendations of potentially useful accommodations. And it's amazing how many of them are free. They don't cost anything to do, but it's often a person doesn't know what they need. So if you can present them with a list of, here's some things that have worked for others, you think any of these might work for you? Again, we're being very person-centered to that point. Job Accommodation Network is the name of the organization. So it's Ask Jan. So ASKJAN. And I won't spell out dot. I think we all know how that one works. And org. It's an ORG website. And then who do they want to know is another thing. We have to be very, very careful that by somebody going in and wanting to try and get the additional support that they need to be a more effective employee isn't going to expose them if they don't want to be exposed. Again, I am very, very upfront about being autistic. I don't care whether I'm talking to, senior executives or a couple hundred people in the world. I'm, happy to say I'm autistic. I'm proud of being autistic. But that's not how a lot of people are. And a lot of it was built up just through childhood of being put down for it continually. You become a little sensitive and not saying anything about that. So we have to make sure that we respect whether, they want to be open about it or whether they want to have this handled in a little more discreet manner. And being a neuro-inclusive colleague, a couple little things. Disclosure. If somebody can disclose to you that they have a particular neurodistinction, it's going to make it easier for you to work with them. But if they don't disclose, that doesn't mean that you can't work with them. What you just need to recognize is look at whatever the behavior that's causing the challenge. Maybe the challenge you're having is the person just can't manage to get their work organized. Well, who cares whether they can't get their work organized because they have ADHD or that they have autism and they can't get their work organized, or they just can't get their work organized and they're neurotypical. The problem is they can't get their work organized. So let's just focus on how can I help you be more organized in your work? So we don't have to get people to disclose. It's nice, it's helpful, it's useful, but we can't force people to do what they're not comfortable to doing. But we don't have to. We just have to recognize, oh, that person seems to have a challenge when they're in a meeting. They never raise their hand and speak up. Maybe we can help them by saying, hey, Martha, what is your thought on this thing? I'd love to hear what you think because I know you work in this area a lot. And draw them in. Well, does that sound like diversity kind of things? Yes. Same thing we would do with any type of diversity. So the big thing is you can't ask people to disclose, but you certainly can recognize what the challenge they're having is and ask how you can help them with that challenge. Because the challenge is obvious to everybody. Why the challenge is, who cares? Nice to know maybe, but who cares? We're not, I don't know. You're a health organization. Some of you may be doctors. I was going to say, we're not all doctors, but some of you may be doctors. So we're not trying to diagnose the person. We're trying to help them with a challenge. And if the challenge is disorganization, if the challenge is remembering what happened at a meeting and the details they were supposed to do, hey, let's just talk to them about that challenge and how can we help them? What can we do to help support them in that area? And maybe if we do that, then they'll finally be willing to step forward and say, this is where my challenge comes from. And now, as you understand more about them, you can become even more helpful. But never, 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 don't diagnose somebody and don't push people to disclose. So inclusive co-working, everybody communicates differently, has different communication preferences. I personally get distracted real easy, which is not only an ADHD trait, it's also can be an autistic trait. And I turn off all of my notifications. I don't care whether it's an instant message, whether it's an email, or I don't care, if it's a message from God. I don't want a notification jumping up on my screen because it distracts me and keeps me from accomplishing my work. So you just have to understand that when you communicate to me, I check, about once an hour or so, I'll go back and I'll check and see if there's a message. And you need to understand that's the communication style that for me is the most effective. So things like that we need to follow. And of course, psychological safety. We talk about net diversity all the time. It's just as true with neurodiversity. We have to create the psychological safety that people are willing to say, hey, I've got a problem here. I think about this differently. Can you help me understand it the way that you're talking about it? But if people don't feel safe, they won't do that. And supporting colleagues, we'll go back one. Just be allies, be champions, provide support just like you would for any other of diversity. If you see somebody that is being treated in a way that you don't feel is acceptable, can you be an ally and intercede in that? I think we've all been taught enough diversity courses to know that some of us are just by the nature of what we were born as, have more privilege and more ability to step into something and use that for good. Applies here just as well. So when you see a colleague that's struggling, say, hey, is there some way I can help you with that? Nothing wrong with asking about that. So that's a good way to support colleagues, is just recognizing that they're having a challenge or somebody's giving them a hard time over something that is a challenging area for them. And maybe you can, intercede and kind of take the heat off them by just saying, hey, let me work with them on this one. I know it's an area that's been a challenge. So again, you got to sometimes be a little creative. Sometimes you have to be a little bold, but all of those things will certainly help support other colleagues. The big thing is don't go out and diagnose people. Again, deal with whatever the behavior or the interaction is. Don't worry about why that behavior or interaction. If it's because their skin's a different color and the interaction's going that way, it's just as important to step in as it's because they have a particular neurodistinction. Doesn't matter either way. We need to be allies for everybody. And hiring the full range of talent. It's important to make hiring fully inclusive because people do communicate differently. For instance, in autism, it's not uncommon. I don't speak this way. I did and went to a great vocal coach and learned not to do it anymore. But autistics tend to be very monotone when they speak, and they just have a very monotone voice, and they think of them. If you're going through an interview and the person's talking to you monotone like this, how excited are you going to think of them being about that job? You're going to say, if I sounded like that, I'm not very excited about whatever we're talking about. You've got to recognize that if they say they like the job, they like the job. Don't second guess because they had the way their vocality or their vocal tone came across meant that they didn't like it. If they said, geez, this job sounds really interesting and I'd be interested in it, don't say, oh, well, they're disconnected. They really didn't mean that. No, they really did mean that. They just don't have a lot of range in their vocal tone. So little things like that we need to adjust in the hiring process so that we're not being biased and eliminating people that are different. Again, no different than regular diversity. We've got to make sure that it's fair to everybody. And that brings us to the end in questions and answers. Probably the easiest way, I'm always terrible reading them on chat if we want to kind of start. Oh, there we go. John, are you going to pass them along? How are we going to do this? People can certainly unmute and just ask a question. I'm fine with that if people are comfortable unmuting and speaking up, or however we want to do it. Guess you can put your message in chat too, and I can read them. Yes, I see your husband is autistic and had no idea that monotone was related to that. Yes, it is related to that. And I'll tell you, before I went to the vocal coach and learned how to come across with, well, what he said was he was going to put emotion into every word that I say. I come to find out my wife, the tone of my voice used to actually just aggravate the hell out of my wife. So, yes, kind of not sounding normal in the tonality of their voice is pretty common in autism. Oh, okay. I've worked in the IT world now for about 25 years, and for quite a while I worked as a independent consultant, and it was for my own company, but I took on different consulting jobs along the way. Which tip if you're autistic and get fired a lot, it's a great way to cover up for it because I worked for the same company. It was my company, but nobody knows that, and I just had different clients. But at the same time, I decided I wanted to start a manufacturing company. And I signed on the dotted line for about $500,000 I didn't have. And I opened a manufacturing company knowing nothing about manufacturing. And I ran it for 10 years, was successful. What is that? 95% of companies go out of business by 10 years. So I beat a lot. But having two careers and getting 5 hours of sleep every night finally wore me down and burned me out. And my wife finally said, you need to go do something about that. And that's what got me to the primary physician who gave me some antidepressants, didn't really diagnose me, but that seemed to make me interact with people a little better than I was. And I was severely burned out at that point. And I just decided that if the family physician could do that well, I bet if I went to a psychiatrist who specializes in this stuff, they could do better. And that's where I actually got diagnosed, was just burned out. And my wife finally saying, you got to go do something about it. Another common way is kids. If your kid gets diagnosed and you weren't, but you're in listening to the medical people telling you about autism, about your kid, and you start going, that sounds like me. That sounds like me. I'd say probably 30-40% of adult diagnosis comes through recognizing it from your kid. Yeah, it definitely was. It's been an interesting journey of self-discovery. I will certainly admit to that. And if you had asked me 10 years ago, would I be speaking to audiences around the globe? The answer would have been, yeah, right. I would have laughed at you. And now I speak to audiences around the globe. And it has been a phenomenal, interesting trip. And it's been very satisfying of helping other people not have to suffer through what I did by creating the awareness out there that there are people that think different, and that's not wrong. The problem is many organizations don't embrace that different thinking. How did your relationships? Oh, that's a hard one. You can't fix somebody that doesn't want to be fixed. I think we've probably all tried that sometime in our life. And all you can really do would be start exposing them to things that might make them recognize that they have some challenges so maybe it's podcasts. Maybe there's no good TV shows at this point, but there's great podcasts that are out there. There's great books that are out there. But I'd say podcasts are the easiest thing to slip by somebody. You just start playing it out loud instead of through your earphones, and they're going to hear some of it. And again, you can't change them until they're ready to change. But if they start hearing things that start clicking with them, there's a possibility that they'll do something. Or you can do like my wife did and just threaten me and tell me I got to go. Period. That might work for some people. I see one here. How did your relationships change after you were diagnosed? Did they improve? Did any worsen? Yes, they improved greatly. My wife and I, before I was diagnosed, it was actually just about the time I was diagnosed, we were going to a marriage counselor, and she gave us the recommendation that we should get divorced. We fired her. Any marriage counselor that says you should get divorced probably means they're not a very good marriage counselor. And that was, I don't know, now like almost 8 years ago. And we'll be celebrating our 38th anniversary next month. So it totally changed it, because what my wife recognized was I wasn't being the flaming a-hole that it seemed like at times. I was just having an autistic meltdown because I was burned out and just had lost it, basically. So when she was able to interpret the right way, is instead of interpreting it the way, if she acted that way, what would it mean? Totally revolutionized our relationship. And no, none of them got worse. I have now better and more relationships with more people now than I've ever had in my life. And a lot of it was understanding that I was different. A lot of it was being willing to step out and actually talk about this stuff and find out how many people want to know about it. And you build up a relationship through that. So no, none got worse, but definitely a huge number got better or got started that never existed. Concept of autism spectrum. I'm just kind of guessing as they come up. The autism spectrum, people get confused on it. Because what people think about when they think of the spectrum is they think of a continuum, and they think of over here as really bad, heavily impacted, need full-time support. Over here is wonderful, like me, can go and work at major tech companies and not need, any special support to get in the door. And they think it's just a range, evenly, somewhere in between there. But that's not how it works. The definition of a spectrum condition is that there are a variety of different human traits at unusual levels, and you can have any combination of those and still be autistic. I like to say, if you think back to the game, the pickup sticks kind of game, it had all the little different color sticks, you threw them in a pile and you grabbed a handful. That describes a spectrum condition much more. The combination of which ones you get and at what intensity they are can vary from person to person, but they still are autistic because they have these few core traits that define autism. And the core traits that define autism is challenges in communication and challenges in social interaction. Those are the real core traits. All the rest of them, one person can have them, one person cannot have them. So autism spectrum disorder is really saying that there's this whole bunch of different traits, and depending upon what combination, at what levels of these human traits you have, you'll be anywhere from what they call level 3, severely impacted, likely to need support most of your life, all the way to level 1, which would be somebody like me that in most situations can get by just fine. Have to learn a few tricks now and then, but don't need much support at all. But that doesn't mean that two people that are level 1 that don't need much support are going to be anything similar. I know other people that need no support that you would not get them talking to live like this to a group of people to save their life. But that's just difference in individuals. So that's kind of the ASD, the autism spectrum, is you got to recognize it's not a line from one end to the other end. It's this heap of different pieces, and anybody can have any combination of them. How IQ impacts neurodiversity, how depression affects it. The IQ part is interesting. I haven't seen any great studies on it. When you deal with, I know the autism side more because that's what I've studied, but with autism, you have about a 20% chance of having an IQ over 120, but you also have about a 40% chance of having an IQ under 80. So in other words, it almost like it flattened the curve out. There's less people in the middle, but there's more pushed off to the ends. I think it probably also happens with a lot of the other neuro distinctions because the brain's being wired different ways. Some of them give you more IQ, some of them give you less IQ. But I can only support that from the autism side distinctly. From the other ones, it's more just extending out to the range of people I know.
one more from a little higher up in the chat, and I think we'll wrap this up. This is a little outside of our purview here, but how can we support children to not feel stigma toward conditions? We want them to be aware, but often can feel put down or excluded.
Well, the first thing is you're going to get me on my soapbox on this one. There is far too much going on of trying to turn children into not being who they are. Whether it's autism, ADHD, dyslexia, it doesn't matter what condition, of trying to make them be, quote, normal. And that's about the worst thing you can do. We've all come to recognize that gay conversion therapy is not effective. All it does is drive up suicide rates. And I look at it as, if you're trying to change an autistic person, an ADHD person into being a neurotypical, a quote, normal person, it's like gay conversion therapy. You're trying to say you can't be who you really are. You have to be somebody we tell you you're going to be. So that's the first thing, is you've got to accept them for who they are and value them for who they are. Because otherwise, you're going to drive them into a shell because they're constantly being put down about it. So I'd say that that's one of the biggest things is you got to value them for who they are and accept that if you got an autistic kid, you got an autistic kid. If you got a kid with ADHD, you got a kid with ADHD. Guess what? They're going to be an autistic adult or they're going to be an ADHD adult. It's not going to change. Now, can they learn skills and techniques to interact with a broader spectrum of the world as they get older? Yes, obviously they can learn some techniques, but it's important to not say, you don't have value unless you can do these things. You have value just because you're a human. Now, if you can do these things, you can go further in life. And I think if we put it that way, we won't have the problem with kids of not wanting to admit it and not wanting to be proud of who they are. Just value them for who they are because they bring uniqueness to the world. Who knows? Maybe they're the next Elon Musk. The guy seems to be doing pretty good for an autistic dude. Well, I think we're pretty much hit our time, and I appreciate everybody. It's been just absolutely wonderful, and love chatting with you. Love the questions, and absolutely love what you're doing at DaVita. It's an important part that we recognize that diversity is also things we can't see, and it's how our minds work just as much as it is our skin color or our gender or our orientation. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. We hope that you've enjoyed another episode of Life in a Neurotypical Universe. Please, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends. Go take their phone and subscribe them. Heck, it will help us all out. If you want to know more about neurodiversity or have any questions for me, you can reach me at my website, timgoldstein.com, where I'll be more than glad to help you as best I can to navigate through the neurotypical universe.